Welcome, everyone. It's fantastic to have you all here. Victoria and I have been really looking forward to this chat we're going to have. I was thinking actually just today how I met Victoria. It's probably way back in 2004 or 2005. That's just when we started Anecdote. And I went over to London to run one of our programs over there. And I was chatting to different people, talking about stories and storytelling. And everyone I was bumping into was sort of saying, look, if you're interested in stories, you need to meet Victoria Ward, right? And I must have heard it 5-6 times. And I thought, okay, I better seek out this person. So did, and we've had this really great connection over those periods of time. The first project we did, Victoria, remember the Royal Mail? I did a little snippet in the Royal Mail project, and which was fabulous. And then we got a really interesting project, of a global project actually, with Shell, and we were helping them teach their chief financial officers, actually. Remember that one, where we're teaching them how to tell the story of why they were actually implementing SAP. Yeah. I know. It would have.
One of those really dramatic, heroic stories.
That's right, a dramatic, heroic story, exactly. Yeah. But very important for those guys to have. I mean, their chief financial officers had realised that they had been working on it for a good year, and they didn't know why they were doing it.
It's actually a very that was very interesting. Their insight into understanding they needed to find a story to tell was quite unusual at that stage, I thought.
Indeed, yeah. It was early on. So the way we were thinking of doing this is that we're going to do a series of 4 actually conversations, and we're going to kind of sort of go back and forwards in terms of who's taking the lead in describing a bit of a case study, if you like. So I'm going to kick off with a case study in this conversation. Victoria is going to respond. We're going to have to talk about it, the things that we have learned. Guess what? We haven't actually practiced this. This is
really it.
It's live, so who knows what might happen here. But the interesting thing is we want to share just some of the lessons that we've learned in doing large-scale story programs in large corporations, and hopefully. Through your questions and comments in the chat window, we'll add another layer of understanding and sort of knowledge sharing, I guess, in what we're doing.
Yeah.
We will record this, but we're sort of recording it mainly just for Victoria and I's, reflection later on. We don't have a plan to share it, so I recommend you take notes, and the people who turn up are the people who are going to benefit from this conversation. I think I mentioned before we started, but I'll mention again that my colleague Sinden Adams is sort of sitting in the background, helping us tackle different questions as they come up, and helping us along, just so that we don't get too, sort of myopically focused on the conversation and miss some good questions that you send. So send your questions to the Q&A panel. Type all the things you'd love to type in the chat panel. Make sure you send them to panelists and attendees so that everyone can see them. Unless you want to send something specifically to us and only we will see it, just select the attendee, the panelist. And I think that's all I need to say to set things up. Is there anything you wanted to kick things off, the things I've missed in the intro there, Victoria?
Well, I guess the only thing which I was thinking about how it comes to be that we're doing this together, because there are some great storytelling people around the world that we know and that we love and we work with. But I feel as though you and I have a kind of special chemistry right from the beginning, when you did the Royal Mail work with us, and then the toing and froing with Shell and sort of other work and ideas. There's a sense in which we borrow from and lend to each other, even though we're fiercely protective about what we know and proud of it. There's a real sense of ease with which we borrow each other's ideas, lend each other stuff, talk things through. And I think that's why we thought that actually for us, this chat is kind of a wonderful chance for us to sit down and have the kind of conversation we sometimes rush a bit. So that I just wanted to add that to you.
That's true. That's lovely.
Cool.
Now, let me jump in then. So the the situation or the case that I want to share is actually around some work that we've been doing over the last 12 months, and it's sort of continuing on this year. And it's for one of the large banks. Now, banks in Australia are getting a good walloping at the moment because we've had, I don't know if you've been following this, Victoria, but we've had a royal commission into the banking industry. It's actually the banking, insurance, and finance industries, I think, are the three areas. And it's focused entirely on the misconduct of those particular organisations. So you can imagine that, and we've had CEOs lose their jobs over this. So we had AMP, the CEO and their chairman resign. The same's just happened for the National Australia Bank. So, this is, a really big time in how almost like the community expectations are shifted, and, the banks are feeling it. Well, one of the banks, almost right in the middle of all this, got in contact with us and sort of said, look, one of the recommendations that have came out of an inquiry that happened really before the Royal Commission was that they had to remove incentives from the front line. Now, we've had banks overseas that have had similar problems. Wells Fargo had all those issues where they had these crazy incentives that drove people to do things like open false bank accounts just so that they could hit their numbers and things like that. Well, in Australia, we had not as bad as that, but weird and poor behaviour, quite frankly, from the front line. And so they've been told you can't have incentives. So this particular bank's thinking, okay, if we can't have incentives in the front line, how do we move it from explicit incentives to implicit ones? And because we'd been talking to them about stories and storytelling, they agreed that the implicit, if you like, reward would actually be to hear the stories of their customers and connect those stories to the purpose of the bank. And we were sort of inspired actually by, let me see, the Wharton professor. I'm just trying to think of his name now. I'm just having a blank. It'll come to me in a minute. Someone might be able to tell me on the chat window just to spark my memory. But he did this experiment in a call centre where they divided the call centre in half. Half were reminded of like the financial benefits. Thank you, Adam Grant. Well done, Sandri. Adam Grant was the professor who did this work. So he had half the call centre reminded of the great benefits that they were getting, and the other half were reminded of the impact they were having on their customers. And when they sort of looked at the performance of the two groups, the group that was reminded of their rewards, etc., didn't have any difference to the control group that was reminded of nothing. And whereas the guys who were reminded of the impact they were having, they doubled their output. They doubled the number of calls. They doubled the number of donations they were getting. They were essentially collecting donations for a university.
So the idea that you were testing, the idea that you were going to test then was whether if you reward people with something that has meaning through a story, that will in some way shift them from this reward through money mindset that they have been fixed on.
That's right.
So
and
is that what's going on
That's
here?
what it was, yeah. And it was, and interestingly, all they did in the experiment was they told stories, right? For the guys who were reminded of the impact to their customers, they just told stories. Now, it's so interesting when you read the research, they didn't really make a big thing of stories, but when I saw it and I looked at what they were sharing, they're stories, right? So we sort of pitched that idea to the bank and combined it really with the Ritz Carlton and what they do with sharing stories in the front line in a systematic, ongoing way. And so they did that, and they called the customer impact stories. And we ended up training 1,700 branch managers all around Australia to help their branches, the frontline branches, to find and tell customer impact stories on a regular basis.
That's a massive scale to operate at. I mean, just
It was a
logistically,
big job, yeah.
did you and Mark just fly everywhere in Australia and run workshops then?
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
pretty much. And it was a combination of just workshops, webinars, sort of built-in deliberate practice elements. There were embedding sort of techniques done by the bank employees. And so it was a multifaceted element in terms of just getting people to go through that process of finding and telling customer impact stories.
So I'm curious to, can I ask you a question
Yeah,
about
yeah.
that?
Fire
Okay,
away.
so I'm curious to know, if you're very much in a survival day-to-day, this is how I earn my living, and you know, if you're in that kind of quite small focus mindset, and suddenly there's a huge, let's call it a narrative shift in the whole regulated environment,
Yeah.
that trickles down to me and takes something away from me, I'm going to turn up to a storytelling workshop with my arms crossed, feeling pretty resistant. So how did you get them to turn up and tell, and then figure out and see the benefit and connect that to the bigger picture?
Well, it's so interesting. We didn't really find that to be the case. We found that the people from the front line were almost, they really care about their customers.
Right, okay.
And it was like a relief, finally. They were given permission by the guys up the ladder to actually share the customer stories. You know,
that's so interesting. So
yeah,
they were given permission to bring themselves to work and the things that matter to them and their relationships. So, so they change. Ah, okay.
And
that's so interesting.
Now, I just want to make sure I haven't missed any sort of. Someone's asked, how was it received? So they're asking the same question, Victoria. So was there resistance from the bank employees? Well, let me just put it this way. You know, I've sort of suggested from Victoria's question that it was received quickly, but the thing that they struggled with is what it kind of meant. At first, the word story is always a difficulty in large organisations, especially ones which have got a very transactional mindset. And so there was a couple of things we had to help them learn, right? The first thing we had to help them learn was the small stories were more important than the big stories. So, for example, I remember this one group, and I had already got them to, before they walked in to do the training, they had to find, you know, what we call a customer impact story, and they had to be ready to tell it, right? And so people came in, and there was this ones, I got them to tell the stories, and then I just sort of said, did you hear a story that, you know, really grabbed you, really resonated? And this group in the middle shot their hand up, and they said, oh, we've heard this amazing story. And the story was about a woman in the call center gets this phone call from Egypt, from one of the customers, and the customer's been kidnapped, right? And he's been held hostage in a room where he's been forced to take money out of his ATM. And he's making this quiet phone call to the call center saying, I'm kidnapped, I need help. And so this lady goes, oh, God, I don't know what to do. She's in the call center of the bank, you know. And so she gets a colleague to ring the police. And the police sort of go, well, we're the New South Wales police. We can't really do anything about something that's happening in Egypt. But the people in the bank said, no, this is our customer. You have to do something. Anyway, it got escalated all the way up to Interpol. And next thing you know, they have people in Egypt breaking down the door and letting this guy out, right? So it was this massive story. And by the end, people were telling it, they're like crying, right? This is so important to them. Everyone's applauding, you know, like this is the most amazing story for them. And I said to them, that's fine, but that's not going to happen on a day-to-day basis. You can't hang your hat on a story like that. It's too big, right? And it makes those people who are having the very simple stories go, oh, I don't have one of those.
That's a great point. I've come across that so often. There's a question here from Ash saying, how do you differentiate and make the story stand out? And in a sense, there is that, finding a story that's memorable and things. There's also stories that are so extreme that they're out of the ordinary and therefore actually don't serve that much of a purpose. And You're reminding me of some health. Do you mind if I just share something that
No, that's going to be
emphasizes that?
fabulous.
Okay.
Yeah.
So some health and safety work we were doing with a logistics company, and we were looking at kind of frontline storytelling tools and techniques that they could. And so we came up with this idea of story of the week, and they so a story that would start storytelling, so to spring
Yeah.
other storytelling around health and safety.
Yeah.
And they came up with a story they wanted to use as a sort of a trigger example, which was essentially about kids going on a trip to a site and a kid falling through the stairs because the railings were too widely set and ending up in hospital and all the rest of it. So what is our health and safety story? And I had to rewrite that starter story like 10 times to find the right balance, because people couldn't have a health and safety conversation if they were worried about the kid.
Wow.
So if you tell the story too dramatically,
Yeah.
people are completely distracted by that rather than doing the thing of what are we learning about health and safety. And we found a very interesting thing about what's this balance between a story standing out so it's sufficiently vivid and memorable, but being actually manageable or ordinary enough at the same time. So that thing about
I know. It's so
ordinary
interesting.
really
It's an interesting
important.
balance, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
I also found that the language we used around what we called the program actually, in some cases, got in the way. So, for example, we called this customer impact stories. And a lot of the employees were sort of saying, yeah, I don't impact. It seemed that the word impact seems big to them. And they go, oh, I don't know if it had an impact. You know, the sort of story that they would tell. One of the big changes I noticed in the program was just how they had conversations about their customers, right? So in the past, the way they would have a conversation about a customer, they would say something like, oh, we had a customer come into the bank the other day and they wanted a mortgage. Yeah, well, we sold them a mortgage, but we also sold them mortgage insurance. And they all high-five each other like that was the big thing. And so it was all about the bank as opposed to the customer, really. Whereas now, the sort of conversation they have is they'll say, oh, we had Bob come into the branch the other day. You know, Bob, he's a farmer, just like 20 kilometres out of Moree there, and came in. His wheat thrasher, blew up, and it's right in the middle of harvest. And the poor guy, I mean, it's the worst time. So we had to get some leasing arrangements, and they talk about, what they did for him. And do you know what? He got out, we got it all sorted. He's got his crop in. I saw him the other day. He says it's a bumper crop. He's going to be really well sorted this year. So it's a totally different feeling.
So instead of telling stories about the products, they're telling stories about the people.
And what they're trying to achieve.
What they're trying to achieve. So it becomes a human story in which the product plays an actual role.
That's right.
Huh.
And the real little difference that was making a big difference for them was that we had to get them to use names.
Yes.
Right.
Names for the stories or names for the people?
Names for the people.
Right.
Because before they were just called the customer or the client. No, this is what they said. Oh, we had a customer come in the other day. They had no idea what that person's name was, right? After it happened, a week later. Whereas, when they start to really focus on that, as soon as they started using names, the whole thing lifted, straight away.
See, that's a great example. Change. You've got the person, the real person with the real thresher, with the real needs, but also a high-fiving about, I just sold an extra mortgage protection, blah-de-blah, is not a retellable thing. So one of the things, it's really interesting to think about, who is the second and third teller of this story? And what will make it a story that other people feel they've just got enough material that they can make it their own and
Yeah, that's right. And, I found that the people at the front line were very proud of the great work that they were doing, and they wanted to tell these stories. So we had to look for ways in which it could be built into the fabric of their organisation. I see Paul Stewart's asked the question, can you elaborate a little bit on the Ritz Carlton initiative? I tell you what, Paul, you will recognise this because the Ritz Carlton, they have and it still goes today, right? It's one of their almost like little secret sources. Their whole approach is around making the customer feel great. And the way they do that is every day they are finding examples of great customer service that's happened in the hotel. And they take those stories and then they decide, it sort of goes, all these stories file into the HR department in the different regions. And then the HR people go through the stories and they go, oh my God, this story here is fantastic. We're going to push that story out to all the frontline employees. The team leader's going to tell the story and they're going to have a conversation about it. They do that on a regular basis. In Asia, it's every 2 weeks. In the US, I think it's every month. But it's this ongoing, continuous telling of stories. In some of the casinos, they do it on a daily basis. So the Wynn casinos, Steve Wynn, who is the eponymous owner of those resorts, he sees it as the most important thing that his company has ever done, bar none. Right?
What, the storytelling?
The storytelling.
The
and all he does is get his employees to find out about something that happened today and tell a story and have a conversation about it.
So that goes right back to emphasizing the implicit rather than the explicit rewards, because if your story is a chosen one and is then reshared globally, there's immense satisfaction in your voice having been heard. Indeed. There's a big thread here in the chat I just want us to explore actually about privacy. Confidentiality. Love the point about names it humanizes. Would they use real customer full names? Privacy concerns. And I think that's, in the wow stories, I don't think that matters because it's delight. Although even then, I think you wouldn't use a real full customer story. Yes. You would use a name just sufficiently to give people a way of accessing or retelling the story.
Yeah.
In these more difficult stories, then I think it's worth thinking about real names and fiction and faction and stuff. So
look, this is a massive issue. This was one of the big issues through the whole program, was around privacy and confidentiality. And the approach I took really was to sort of say, it was really based on this, I love this writer called Atul Gawande, right? I don't know if you've come across him, but he's
great.
No, he's writing, okay. So he's a surgeon who writes beautifully for the New York Times, writes books on checklists and things like that. But the way he writes about surgery, he's always talking about patients, and of course this is confidential information. And so what he'll do is he'll tell a story like this. His books are just full of stories. He's like Malcolm Gladwell for surgery, right? And the way he does it, he'll sort of say, so Fred, presented at emergency department with pains in his chest. I mean, Fred's not his real name. We took him into, to check out what we should do, and then we got him into pre-op. And anyway, they start telling the story about Fred, and about halfway through the story, you're going, gee, I hope Fred's okay. But Atul said right at the beginning, this is not his real name, right?
So it's actually signalling that. There are a couple of other, just thinking, because there's quite a lot of discussion in the chat about this confidentiality, anonymity, privacy thing. And there are a couple of other ways of doing it. Well, there's one other way of doing it I just wanted to throw into the pot here, which is the work that I've been doing in storytelling. I work with a brilliant poet and theatre designer called Angie Dove. And she came up with this, she introduced me to this term factional. So in a lot of our work, if these are more difficult stories, people are all telling true stories, and you find the pattern, and then you thread together a factional story, each element of which is true.
Yes.
But which is a kind of composite. So it's a real story in a sense, but the parts of it, it's a composite.
Yes.
And that allows it to be safe. And we've used that technique quite a lot. And the question I had for you around that is, if these are stories that are about more difficult challenges in life, is there a thing where you manage the privacy between your workshop thing and getting people to think which stories they should and shouldn't retell outside the workshop? Is there a kind of limit? you put around retelling when you're talking to people about not just taking other people's stories, or is that a bit looser from your point of view?
Well, I mean, in terms of the people internally, I mean, everyone in a branch will know who the person is, and
Cool.
you know, it's when it starts to get beyond the branch, right? When stories get taken from that, you know, it's sort of almost like it's where it's come from, the location it's come from, and it starts to get put in other parts of the bank, and that's when really you really have to change names. You have to change, you know, those conditions that make it obviously about a particular person. It's a bit like that factional idea, but probably not done in a, you know, as rigorous a way as you might be talking about. But I think you got to do that. I think, but you know, it's hard for people to flip in between factional and you know what actually happened, because
I agree.
They're very proud of what happened. We had this one story which was about a young woman who had come to, you know, the branch for a you know, essentially just to get a loan for a car, and anyway, she had sort of a bad sort of credit sort of ratings, etc. She didn't get the loan, but if you like, the branch manager or one of the people at the branch sort of showed her a few budgeting tools and things that she could do, and helped her with a savings plan. And she ended up getting the loan, you know, another year later, and ended up getting the job that she wanted to get. And she, you know, sort of really helped her a lot in terms of what she wanted to do. But when I told that story to a group of people in another part of the branch, it actually came from that part of the branch. And when a woman put her hand up and says, "That's our story, that's our story, but you haven't told the whole story." And I said, "Oh, okay, what's the whole story?" She said, "Well, this young woman, she was living on the streets, you know, and when we first met her, she was 16. And anyway, she started telling this much more interesting, more rounded story, if you like, about what was going on. But you could sort of see you couldn't tell that whole story when you sort of started sharing in different parts of the bank, because they didn't want to sort of bring all that detail out, if you like. So there's this balancing out between, you know, the impact of the story and, you know, making sure you're protecting, if you like, you know, the individuals and their confidentiality.
Well, I think that's a related thing too, because her putting her hand up could have been quite, "What are you doing taking my story away and doing something else with it?" Rather than,
she submitted the story. Like, it's not like it wasn't a mystery that the story was. No.
But what I mean is that for me, as a reteller of other people's stories, if they happen to say, "Actually, that was my story and it happened a bit differently," my job as the reteller is to step back and give her room to reclaim it. That was what I was kind of after. So thinking about us as, you know, fetchers and carriers of stories, which we often are, to start a new conversation. And
that's true
too in the culture. There's lots of questions here, so I just wonder, because
we should look at some of those. I have noticed that one about evoking stories in exchange of monetary benefit. I don't know if we're doing that at all. In fact, there's no direct monetary benefit to. It's not like for every story you get $10 or anything like that. They get their salary, no doubt about that, but it's quite different than what it was before, where they actually got, you know, if they sell a mortgage, they used to get money for it. Guess what? They would sell a mortgage, you know, so it's quite a different environment altogether. So I think that's...
You're also not shoving values down people's throats. Just before I come to this long thread on factional, you're giving people a chance to, it sounds like it's been a very successful project, because you're not saying this is about values or this is about the regulator. You're kind of positioning it as, there's a lot more in our small stories than just the money side of things. Let's share those. And actually, you're leaving all of that strategic imperative or whatever, or the bank strategy, right out of view.
That's right. It's out of view.
Just working with this material at the front line. So I think that's quite an interesting thing to notice, is you're not making it too goody.
No. And, you know, there's all sorts of flavours to those stories. Yeah. Absolutely.
So,
what other questions we got there?
Well, I'm just looking. There's a whole load of questions about factional, which we can take. And then earlier, there was the confidentiality ones. I think Oh, and then there's one about visual storytelling or sketch notes, which isn't part of this, but I could say something about if we want to just take those questions. So shall I say a little bit more about factional when? Would that be useful?
Yeah, I think some people would love to know more about that. Yeah.
And then there's one in managing organizational change as well. I might go to the change one first and then say something about factional for a reason. There's something about how you show up as the stranger who's about to run a storytelling thing, right? So when you were talking, and that question makes me think about the positioning of this and the positioning of you as the facilitators of this process. When we were doing some work on storytelling from the front line of a merger between two big government organizations, there was a big quite a systemic storytelling thing, leaders, managers, and then a deep dive into the front line. And we went and did the frontline story collecting and so on around this merger. And we realized after the first of this series of workshops that we had to reposition ourselves because the frontline staff in the frontline offices sort of arrived at the workshop expecting us to change them. You know, we're here to change you. We've been sent by head office to change you through storytelling kind of positioning. And so they were trying to find out either how to resist or please us. So after a couple of these workshops, we said, hang on a sec. We're not here to change you. We're here to make sure your voice gets heard by the board. So you can tell us anything you like, and our job is to help your frontline experiences of the merger be accurately played back to the board. And it completely changed the nature of the workshops because, I mean, in a way, we also then had to manage that because then we were being used as a spokesperson. So obviously there can be a bit of gaming around that. But it did change the nature of people's willingness to throw themselves into their stories when we handled it like that. And so I just wondered how you turned up as the hosts of this storytelling process and how they related to what they thought you were doing. Does that make sense?
And we made sure that it wasn't just very focused on, it was Mark and I, in terms, we were like one small element really in quite a large group of people who were involved in this. And it wasn't just like, here's a workshop, come and we'll change. We knew we had to do a whole range of things over 12 months. And even then, this year, we're doing all this refresher stuff, right? So it's not a sheep dip sort of approach, very much a systemic change approach to understanding that. They did see, though, Mark and I, as, you know, here are the story experts. They're going to teach us how to do story stuff. But they learned by doing it themselves and talking about it and how they actually ran it. I noticed there was a couple of questions on, you know, like what were some of the specifics that we teach in terms of, you know, how to make this better and how this works.
Yeah, let's go there and then I'll do the factional bit after you've done that.
Yeah, okay. Because I suppose probably the most important thing that we got them to do was to work out what the point of their story was and preface the story with the point, right? It seems simple, but it's actually a bit harder to do than you think. So, for example, I'll tell you a story. It's not to do with the bank, but another story. And you tell me what the point of this story is, Victoria, what the potential point is, okay? So we do a lot of work for Mars. It's a family-owned business. And the Mars family are very rich people who have senior roles, you know, so the chairman, key management roles, etc. Anyway, but they're very humble. They don't drive around fancy cars. They don't stay in fancy hotels or anything like that. And they like to be in the business and knowing what's going on. Anyway, John Mars, he's was the chairman at the time, comes to the Wodonga factory, which is in Victoria. It's a pet food factory. You know, it's pretty rough and tumble. You know, everyone's a bit nervous, the fact that the chairman is here. He comes into a meeting, he sits down, some poor guy's, you know, clicking through his presentation. And in the middle of the presentation, the fluorescent light in the room starts flickering, right? And everyone's kind of trying to ignore it. But it gets worse and worse. And then eventually, John Mars just stands up and walks out. And everyone goes, oh my God, we've upset the guy, you know. And moments later, he comes back with a little step ladder. Right? He gets up on the step ladder and he gets the light, pulls it down and puts it to the side of the room, takes the step ladder out, comes back, sits down, doesn't say a word, presentation continues. Right? Well, that little story just flew around that organisation. But what do you reckon? What would be just one of the many potential things, you know, the point or the meaning out of that story, do you think?
Wow, there are so many points. There are so many ways you could make that story work, aren't they?
Yeah.
I think something about the character of our leader. You know, our leader is this kind of a guy, and that makes us proud to be in this kind of an organisation.
Yes, absolutely, right. And in fact, in their organisation, they have 5 or 6 principles, but one of them is take responsibility.
Okay.
Right. So I tell you that because now the way I would like someone to tell that story is to preface the story with the point, right?
Okay.
And so you sort of say, you know what, it's so important in our organisation that our leaders take responsibility. Let me just give you an example. Down at our Wodonga plant, and then you tell that story. Now, when you do that, all of a sudden your stories shrink. People know why they're telling the story. It doesn't ramble and go all over the place like, you know, naturally told stories do. And people know, and especially in a business context, they know why they're listening to the thing. And this makes a phenomenal difference to their storytelling. So just that small tweak.
I like that very much.
Yeah, we call it a relevance statement. You know, when you listen to people tell stories naturally, they often do it. They often do it without even thinking about it, right? So just getting them to do it in a systematic and purposeful way actually really does improve stories told in the organisation. So anyway, that's just one
That's a really good example. Also, the ramble point is great because if somebody who hasn't been listened to for a long time gets the floor, they don't always know how to manage that opportunity. And if you've been in the middle of a story, you want people to hear every single detail of the pain you went through or the excitement. So that way of helping people economize on how to tell the story in a light way so that it fits a small situation. That's a really great example. Yes. Oh gosh, we've got so many questions here. I don't know what to do with myself except spend all day on this webinar. Hang on. Meg, I'm just going to say, why don't we save the visual storytelling or sketch notes? Because I've got a lot of experience of that, and I'll use that. One of the future story examples that I share, we could think about visual storytelling at the heart of that. There's lots of stuff on change as well, but I want to not... and Ronicorn has asked a really good question about how would storytelling success in banking and what would be I guess there's something about why would it be successful for the employees to go on doing it? What do they get out of it would be a good question.
Yeah.
But maybe if we should just hold that, and I should try and at least partly answer the factional question.
Please, do that. Yeah.
So one of the areas where Shawn and I differ a bit, I think, is I take a little bit more of a sort of narrative research approach, which has been evolved over the years. So I'll spend quite, in a way, a lot more time creating narrative databases and kind of going, what are the patterns in these? And then how do we translate those into things that will travel? Now, one of the keys to that is to think about gathering firsthand experience from eyewitnesses. So what we'll often do, for example, in factional storytelling, this is slightly jump up. This was a story I was going to share at another session, but I think maybe quickly now. So you might invite people to journal about quality on the manufacturing floor. So they're part of a kind of a thing like we need to look at quality on the manufacturing floor and improving that. So you might invite people to journal what they notice in a week. Yeah. Just very small. What have I noticed today? Tiny, tiny little fragments of a thing that was good or bad or made me uneasy or whatever. And then do a tiny little bit of coding that up about what kind of a fragment is it. So you end up in a relatively fast way with a lot of small fragments that you can then pattern. with your client and go, well, what are the big patterns that we're hearing from these eyewitness accounts? And which of those patterns do you want to strengthen and which do you want to shift? And then you can go, okay, that's these are the patterns we'd like to strengthen or shift. Now, what kind of stories would we like to pull out that can be told and retold that would help people understand that or start a new conversation? A bit like that health and safety conversation I spoke about earlier, you know, and that's where the factional comes in, because we can go back to the database of fragments and to the first-hand accounts and the stories from the interviews that we've had and create factionalized stories, some of which, Meg, are actually translated into maybe storyboards or posters or whatever, and I can talk a bit more about that another time, which really are true. They're factional. Every single part of them is a true and quite ordinary and tiny everyday moment that is then something that can be used as a factional story to start a new conversation elsewhere, to allow people to reflect on a particular value, like confidence to speak up if you see quality not working on the manufacturing floor or something like that. Now, we do it quite in a certain kind of quite systematic, slightly researchy feeling way, with sort of some creative work around translating those stories to hand them back to people. But the other thing I think is so important here, which echoes with your work, is I believe when we've done that particularly successfully, the fact that when people get the stuff back in a slightly different form, maybe a poster or a script or something to start a new conversation, they're really proud in the same way as your guys might be, or the Ritz Carlton guys might be, because they know they made this story themselves. It might be factional, but they know that some people journaled to find the material that would make these stories, and that sense of ownership, rather than someone else telling them what to do, that sense of agency in this and their product makes a terrific difference in the, you know, this is their stories.
And I think someone did ask that question, you know, like, what value do the employees get out of it? And I think that's where it comes. It comes down to the fact that, you know, they get emotion, right? So before it was just transaction and sort of black and white sort of, you know, ways of dealing with people, and now they get something where they feel emotionally connected. So once you get connected purpose, all of a sudden the whole thing gets lifted up. The other thing that I think is really interesting is that there was some work done by Teresa Amabile. I'm sure that's not how you pronounce her name, but that's how I'm pronouncing her name today. She's a professor, you know, at Harvard and whatnot. But she wrote a book called The Progress Principle, right? And the thing that, in terms of day-to-day work, the thing that we get so much value from is to feel that we're making incremental progress. So if you can see that your customers are getting these little benefits along the way, that brings enormous benefit to the people at the front line. So they really feel that they're making a difference. Whereas if they don't get to see it, like if it's sort of over there somewhere and all they're seeing is an NPS score, and, you know, it's something that they can't feel. So this is what you're doing. And the other thing I'd say too is I've been reading a little bit about Satya Nadella, you know, the CEO of Microsoft, and he is really putting right at the core of his success. So he's turned Microsoft around, right? And he's put at the core is the idea of empathy. Right? Here we are talking about real soft things in a company like Microsoft, right? And that's the thing that he's seen as the real turnaround point for Microsoft, is the fact that they are now giving people that connection to customer, that empathy, getting in the shoes, right, Victoria, of really understanding what the other people are going through. Right, this is vital.
I think that it absolutely is vital, and that whole walking, I know Chris Hyman was in this call, but the whole walking in their shoes thing with the Royal Mail was built on that idea about the gap between what I'm trying to tell you and where you are in your human world. And we could even talk about the design of that at some time, but that empathy thing is really important. I do want to say something else too. There's a fantastic thing here from Lucy saying connecting with heart is so key to change management. I want to I think that's absolutely right. And also you have to manage the fact that words like soul and heart and empathy can send shivers down the leaders. So you have to find a way to do that in a way that feels manageable to them, at least to start with, till they've stepped into this world. But I want to put it another way. In all of the work that I've done over 20 odd years, not all, but all the best work I've done, there's something also for me about witnessing. You know, witnessing somebody's some everyday operator's experience on the manufacturing floor and making it also, you know, being genuinely interested in it and witnessing it allows people then to value their own experience.
Yeah.
So for me, the best kind of storytelling, by creating a kind of witnessing system, I know this sounds awfully kind of, it's not, I hope it doesn't sound too voodoo, but anyway, creating a kind of witnessing system where people genuinely are interested in each other's stories, hear each other's stories, also gives back to the person their own story.
Yeah.
Because their story may have been crushed or muffled or disappeared in whatever, they've tried to tell it before, they haven't been heard or whatever. But that, I think the best storytelling systems actually create this sense that, gosh, you're interested in me.
Yeah.
You're interested in my story, therefore suddenly I find my story interesting.
And, you know,
so I just want to make that point. Yeah.
It reminded me too that, you know, one of the other messages that we really reinforce throughout the whole program is to never use the word story.
Way! Yes, yes.
Because, especially in organisational settings, as soon as anyone says, oh, we have to tell stories, we need to share stories, everyone starts to go, oh my God, what's this fluffy bunny stuff doing, and why are we doing this? And leaders get nervous about it, and, you know, it all sort of falls over a little bit. It's even worse when people start to say, you know, I've got a funny story I want to tell you, or an important story. What we get them to do is talk about experiences.
Nice.
Right? And examples.
Yeah.
And things that happened. Now, of course, they're all stories, right? But you don't use the S word. You've got to remove the S word from the language. This, especially corporations, they really have problems with, in fact, I find it's just about every organisation have problems with the word story.
Do you know, funnily enough, I have had the opposite experience in a current piece of work, but we can come to that another time. Generally, I think that there's a lot to what you say about that positioning so that it's manageable within the cultural context.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah,
and gosh, there are so many brilliant questions here. Harini, your question about using legend or folklore, I'd love to pick up, but probably not this time, because I have worked on the boundaries between legend, folklore, myths, and real stories, and I've got some quite good examples around that, but I think we'd probably have to save that for another session. Anya, don't use MVivo, have our own proprietary tool for the narrative research and the coding up, but if you want to take that offline and I can tell you a bit more about that, I'm really happy to. I do also have an interesting story about how MVivo distances people from the material rather than plunging them into it. So
there has been some you know, questions around organisational change, and really this is what we're talking about here. And the way I like to think of it is that if you want to change a culture, you need to change the stories that are being told.
Yeah.
And in the sort of perspectives I like to take to do that are from three perspectives. One is you'd need an overarching change story, right, that explains why this change is important. And I talk in my book actually about using a clarity story, which is a story structure, which simply goes, look, in the past it was like this, and then something happened, so that's why we're doing this, so the future can be like that. You know, it's a very simple story structure, and it gives a nice overarching narrative. But then you have to give people story skills, right? And that's essentially what we did, is build story skills. And the skills, you know, we somehow wringed story out of corporations. Like, people don't tell stories. Sorry, I shouldn't say. They don't tell stories in formal situations. Like when the manager says, look, we want to get around a table and have a team meeting, you will not hear stories, right? And what we're trying to do is bring stories back into that. They'll tell stories when they're chatting with each other, for a coffee and whatnot, because that's what happens. But we want to bring stories into those sort of formal spaces. A little bit, not too many. And then the other part is, how do you do it in a systematic, ongoing way? And that's where the Ritz Carlton really led the field. We're seeing other places. Very few organisations are doing it systematically. And I would layer on top of all of this is that I and Victoria as well, we're interested in oral stories.
Yes.
Right? And this is the bit that a lot of companies that are getting into storytelling are missing out on, or not getting right. I heard of an organisation that went to great lengths to collecting stories. They plastered them on walls. They put them in the databases. And then guess what? Nothing happened. It's because they didn't get anyone to tell them to each other and talk about them. And isn't that crazy, Victoria? You must have seen.
I think that's a great place, because I'm just looking at the time. It's 10:02 and we kind of need to wrap a bit. We've got so many questions here. We need to take a moment afterwards, I think, to curate them and make sure we bring them back to the next webinar.
Or maybe even on our blogs and stuff like that.
But I want to say I really recognize that terrible urge to write things down. Holding people back from going, yep, that's it. I was just using your clarity story structure actually recently in a piece of work, and then looking at the small moments that you can connect to that to bring it to life, and all the you'd have been proud of me. You'd have been proud of me.
Lovely.
I made people name some of the small moments so they could start to create their story collections, that naming thing, so that you can remember them, all of that. You'd have been really proud of me, Shawn. But there's still this impulse to go, okay, that's right, that's the clarity story, let's write it down, let's put it on a poster.
Put it on the website.
Put it on the website. I go, no. That is a kind of narrative backbone.
Yeah.
That will govern the way you organize, how you connect with people, and the small stories that you use to illuminate parts of it, depending on who you're talking to.
Yes.
If you write it down, you freeze it and you freeze dry it. And it ceases to have its meaning and to connect with what somebody called the heart earlier.
Yes.
So I really agree with you. That urge, that anti-freeze, let's call it, the anti-freeze. So to really prize the oral storytelling culture and understand that that's more fluid, but systemically vital, and be very careful about what you write down is really, really an important thing. So
I think it's just that, because I hear a lot of story projects, they hear a story and they go, oh, how do I need to help me with my story project? I know, journalists do stories.
Yes.
We'll get a journalist.
Yeah.
And it is like, if you want an oral story project, that's the worst person to get in the room. Journalist.
Poor old Sinden sitting here having to suck this up.
I know. She has a degree in journalism, but so I suppose I just reinforcing this idea. You want to be able to share a story and get people to have a conversation about the story.
Exactly.
To us.
Yeah. So for me, you're absolutely right. Stories start conversations, and conversations start the exchange of stories. And it's that you're absolutely. That's a perfect, I think, maybe an end thing for this time. I'm so grateful to you all for coming. I'm so grateful for your brilliant questions, and I know Shawn is too. We'll take a moment to look at them and think about how we make sure that we've acknowledged them and offered something for the clusters of questions. Next time, I had thought that what I would look at is a slightly is actually similarly a narrative shift in the regulatory environment. So the regulator in this particular sector is getting ferocious about fining, and the culture of the corporation needs to shift from a situation where compliance are, if you like, policing the business to partnering with the business. And what is the role of the leaders in signaling that shift through their storytelling? I thought that might be an interesting case study. I do also, Tracy and other people have quite a lot of stuff about visual storytelling.
Yeah.
So maybe that would be the other thing that we could talk about. That might mean that I have to screen share a bit and show a couple of things.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
We'll see how that goes.
Let's use the technology, right?
Yeah.
One
do we have a
last.
date? We don't have a date, do we? We don't have. It's about 6
Not
weeks.
yet, no. But I do have a date I want to share with people, and that is, so I'm heading to London and running a Storytelling for Leaders program on the 18th of June. So if anyone happens to be in that part of the world, 18th of June. And then I think if you're going to be in Amsterdam in the 20th and 21st of June, I'm going to the Getting Things Done conference. So that's totally different, but I'll just throw that out there for the off chance that someone is in that part of the world and would like to catch up and have a coffee. I'd love to meet them. Well, guys, cool. Thanks very much for coming along. It's tremendous to see everyone here, and we look forward to seeing you in another session and hopefully pick up on more of the questions that you've shared with us. It's been tremendous. Thanks very much.
Right. Yeah, thank you all very much. And thanks you,
Victoria.
Shawn, for suggesting it.
Yes.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Cool.
Bye for now.
Bye now.